The Texas Panhandle in 1878 wasn't a place for the faint of heart. It was a land of bleached bones and broken promises, where the sun beat down with the fury of a vengeful god. For Lucinda Dalton, a widow clinging to the only home she'd ever known, survival was a daily battle fought with grit and gunpowder. She thought she had seen the worst this unforgiving land had to offer: the drought, the sickness that took her husband, the loneliness that gnawed at her soul. But she was wrong. One blistering afternoon, a sound on the wind, thin and desperate, would lead her to a choice that would rewrite her future and ignite a conflict that threatened to burn everything she held dear to the ground. She was about to discover that the most dangerous thing in the West wasn't the heat or the rattlesnakes. It was the desperate heart of a father. The heat was a physical presence. It shimmered above the alkali flats, distorting the distant mesas into drunken, wobbling specters. Lucinda May Dalton squinted her hand, shielding her eyes as she scanned the horizon. There was nothing. Nothing but the endless, brutal expanse of baked earth and the shimmering, merciless sky. It had been 2 years since the fever took Samuel, leaving her the sole guardian of their 300 acres of dust and defiance, a small ranch held together by sweat memory and the stubborn refusal to surrender. Her property, the Dalton homestead, was an island in a sea of desolation, its only redeeming feature a slender, life-giving artery called Whispering Creek. The creek was the reason they'd settled here, and the reason she'd die before letting it go. That afternoon, the silence was different. Usually it was a heavy blanket, comforting in its familiarity. Today it was thin, stretched, taut, and pricked by a sound she couldn't initially place. It was a high-pitched, reedy cry, almost lost in the keening of the wind that scraped across the plains. At first she dismissed it as a hawk or a coyote pup, but it came again sharper this time, laced with a note of pure, unadulterated terror. Curiosity, a dangerous commodity in this land, got the better of her. With her Winchester rifle resting in the crook of her arm, its stock worn smooth by her and Samuel's hands, she stepped off the porch of her small sod house. The wood groaned under her worn leather boots. She walked toward the sound, her eyes scanning the rock-strewn gully that bordered the western edge of her property. As she drew closer, the crying was joined by other sounds, the low, guttural growls and excited yips of coyotes. Her blood ran cold. They were hunting. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cresting a small rise, she saw them. A pack of 5, lean and mangy, their fur the color of the dust they stood on. They were circling something small, a bundle of something lying near the base of a thorny mesquite bush. One of the larger coyotes darted in, snapping its jaws. The bundle let out another terrified wail. It wasn't an animal, it was a baby. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back. This was not her fight. This was the wild, unforgiving law of the land playing out. But the sound of that cry, so utterly helpless, hooked into her soul. She thought of the small, unmarked grave next to Samuel's, the child she had carried for 6 months, and lost to a bitter winter chill. A fire cold and hard ignited in her chest. "Get away from him!" she roared, her voice swallowed by the vastness, but sharp enough to make the coyotes flinch. She raised the Winchester, the metal hot against her shoulder. She didn't have a clean shot at the animals without risking the child. She fired into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed across the plain, sharp and violent. The coyotes scattered for a moment, startled, their yellow eyes glowing with feral cunning. But hunger was a stronger master than fear. They regrouped, snarling, their attention divided between her and their intended meal. Lucinda knew she had to close the distance. She scrambled down the rocky incline, her boots slipping on the loose scree. Get out of here, you devil dogs!" The pack leader, a grizzled male with a torn ear and a black-lipped snarl, decided to challenge her. It lowered its head and charged. There was no time to aim. She swung the heavy rifle like a club, catching the animal across the skull with a sickening crunch of bone. It yelped a choked, pathetic sound and crumpled into a heap. The remaining four hesitated, the smell of their leader's blood confusing them. That was all the opening she needed. She rushed forward, screaming with a fury she didn't know she possessed, and scooped up the bundle from the dirt. She didn't dare look at it. She just turned and ran, scrambling back up the rise, the yips and snarls of the pack chasing her heels. She didn't stop until the solid wood of her front door was slammed shut and the heavy bar dropped into place. Her lungs burned. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely stand. She leaned against the door, listening. The coyotes whined and scratched at the wood for a minute before the scent of their fallen leader drew them back to the gully. Only then did she allow herself to look down at what she held in her arms. It was a baby boy, no more than a few months old. He was wrapped in a piece of rawhide, intricately beaded in a pattern she didn't recognize, but it was undeniably Comanche. His skin was feverish, his face scratched and caked with dirt. A nasty gash from a coyote's tooth oozed blood on his tiny arm. His eyes were squeezed shut, and his breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. He was dying. Her mind raced. Whose child was this? Where were his people? A Comanche baby this deep into settled territory meant only one thing. There had been a raid, a fight, something violent. Taking him in was an act of madness. If his people came looking for him, they might see her as a kidnapper and burn her home to the ground. If the townsfolk from Redemption Gulch, 20 miles east, found out she was harboring a savage, she'd be ostracized or worse. The Texas Rangers wouldn't ask questions. She should leave him on the porch. Let nature take its course. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing to do. The baby stirred his tiny hand, uncurling. His fingers, impossibly small, brushed against her rough, calloused palm. In that moment, he wasn't a Comanche. He wasn't a symbol of a war she wanted no part in. He was a child alone and dying. He was the ghost of her own lost hope. "Damn it all," she whispered to the empty room, her voice thick with emotion. "Damn it all to hell." Carefully she carried him to the small basin of water she kept by the stove. The fight against the coyotes was over. The fight for his life was just beginning. The first night was a descent into a waking nightmare. The baby whom she had taken to calling Little Cat for the fierce, tiny sounds he made burned with a fever that seemed determined to consume him. Lucinda worked with a frantic, desperate energy, her small home transformed into an infirmary. She cleaned the coyote bite on his arm first, her stomach churning at the sight of the torn flesh. She had no doctor's tools, only what the land and her own hard-won knowledge provided. She washed it with whiskey, a precious commodity she saved for the worst snake bites or deepest despairs, and listened to the child's agonized shriek, a sound that pierced her heart. Then she mashed yarrow leaves, a trick her mother had taught her, into a poultice to stave off infection, and packed it into the wound, binding it with a strip torn from one of Samuel's old shirts. The fever was the greater enemy. She bathed him constantly in cool water from the creek, wiping his small hot body with a soft rag. His skin was a dark copper, and his hair was a shock of the blackest silk. He was beautiful, and the sight of his vulnerability made a fierce, protective instinct roar to life inside her. She remembered the herbs her grandmother, a woman who trusted the earth more than any doctor used to gather. Out in the fading light, she frantically searched the creek bed, her fingers digging through the soil to find the precious roots of pleurisy weed, to help his breathing, and the leaves of willow bark to fight the fever. She brewed a bitter tea, forcing tiny precarious drops between the baby's cracked lips with the tip of her finger. All through the night she sat in the rocking chair Samuel had built for her, the baby cradled in her arms. The rhythm of the rocking was a prayer. The creak of the floorboards was a hymn. Every ragged breath the child took was a victory. In the flickering lamplight she studied the intricate beadwork on the rawhide wrapper. It was the work of a loving mother, the patterns telling a story she couldn't read but could feel in the meticulous stitches. Where was that mother now? The thought brought a fresh wave of sorrow and fear. By dawn, the fever broke. One moment he was radiating heat like a furnace. The next, a fine sheen of sweat covered his body, and his breathing deepened, evening out into the steady rhythm of sleep. Lucinda wept silent tears of exhaustion and relief carving the paths through the grime on her face. He was alive. He had fought, and he had won the first battle. The next few days settled into a strange, secret routine. The baby little cat grew stronger. He began to take goat's milk, which she patiently fed him from a small leather pouch she fashioned. His dark, intelligent eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin. Sometimes a ghost of a smile would touch his lips, and Lucinda would feel a joy so profound it frightened her. She was getting attached. She was building a home in her heart for a child who could be torn away at any moment, leaving a wound far deeper than the one his absence had already left. Her isolation, once a source of comfort, now became a wall of fear. Every sound, the cry of a hawk, the rattle of a loose shutter, sent a jolt of panic through her. Was it his people? Was it someone from town? A week after she found him, her supplies ran perilously low. She needed flour salt and more bandages. The trip to Redemption Gulch was unavoidable. The thought of leaving the baby alone was terrifying, but the thought of him starving was worse. She swaddled him tightly and placed him in a makeshift cradle she'd set up in the root cellar, a dark, cool space hidden beneath a trap door in her floor. It was the safest place she could think of. "I'll be back before sundown," she whispered to the sleeping child, her voice catching. "You be strong for me, little cat." The 20-mile ride to Redemption Gulch was a gauntlet of anxiety. The town was little more than a single dusty street, lined with a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. It was a place that tolerated her existence as long as she kept to herself. Inside Peterson's general store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured meat, and local gossip. Mildred Peterson, a woman whose face was permanently pinched in a state of disapproval, eyed Lucinda over the rim of her spectacles. "Dalton," she said, her voice dry as a bone. "Thought maybe a dust devil had carried you off. Still here, Mildred?" Lucinda replied, her voice flat as she handed over her list. As Mildred gathered the items, Sheriff Brody pushed through the door. He was a big man running to fat, with a sweaty face and small, predatory eyes. He worked for the most powerful man in the county, Bartholomew Corrigan, a cattle baron who was relentlessly buying up all the small ranches, all except hers. Corrigan wanted her land, specifically her creek, and he wasn't a man who took no for an answer. "Lucinda," Sheriff Brody said, his tone a poor imitation of friendliness. "Been a while. Getting lonely out there all by your lonesome." "I manage," she said, not meeting his gaze. "Mr. Corrigan was just asking about you," Brody went on, leaning against the counter. "He's worried about a lone woman out there. Still willing to make you a very generous offer for that parcel of yours. Enough to set you up real nice back east." "The answer is the same as it was last month, Sheriff. I'm not selling." Brody's eyes narrowed. "That creek of yours is drying up everywhere else, A man could get powerful thirsty. It's a dangerous world. Indians, outlaws. A woman can't protect a thing like that on her own forever. The threat was veiled, but it hung in the air like smoke. Lucinda gathered her supplies, her knuckles white as she gripped the sack of flour. I'm not on my own. I have Samuel's rifle and a steady hand. You tell Mr. Corrigan that. She turned and left the sheriff's cold chuckle following her out the door. The ride home was fueled by a new kind of fear. It wasn't just the baby's people she had to worry about. Corrigan was closing in. He wanted her water, and he would stop at nothing to get it. She galloped the last mile, her heart pounding with a terrible premonition. When she threw open the cabin door, everything seemed normal. She rushed to the trap door, her hands fumbling with the iron ring. "Little cat!" she called down into the darkness. There was no answer, only silence. A thick, suffocating silence that told her something was terribly wrong. Her world tilted on its axis. He was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Lucinda. She dropped her sack of supplies, flour puffing out in a white cloud on the floorboards. She scrambled down the ladder into the root cellar, the lantern in her hand, casting frantic, dancing shadows on the earthen walls. The cradle was empty. The small blanket lay rumpled, as if its occupant had simply vanished. "No!" She breathed the word, a raw whisper of disbelief. "No, no, no." Her mind reeled. Had the Coyotes somehow gotten in? Impossible. The cabin was sealed. Had he been taken? Her eyes darted around the cellar. There was no sign of a struggle. She climbed back out her gaze, sweeping the main room. The heavy bar on the door was still in place from the inside. The windows were shuttered. No one could have gotten in or out. Then she saw it. On the floor near the trap door lay a single dark feather, tied with a thin strip of red-dyed sinew. It hadn't been there when she left. Her blood ran cold. Someone had been inside her home. Someone who could move without a sound, who could bypass locks and bars as if they were suggestions. His people. They had come. They had found their child and taken him back. A wave of emotions crashed over her relief that he was with his family, followed by a gut-wrenching, cavernous sense of loss. The silence of the cabin was suddenly deafening, amplifying the absence of the small, fragile life that had filled it for the past week. She sank into the rocking chair, the feather clutched in her hand. And for the first time since Samuel's death, she felt utterly and completely alone. The brief, unexpected season of motherhood was over. The next few days were a blur of hollow routine. She mucked out the stable, mended a fence, and patched the roof, the physical labor, a welcome distraction from the ache in her chest. But at night the silence returned, and with it the ghosts. The ghost of Samuel, the ghost of her stillborn daughter, and now the ghost of a little Comanche baby who had stolen a piece of her heart. The threat from Bartholomew Corrigan, however, was no ghost. It was real, and it was escalating. A week after her trip to town, two of his ranch hands, rough men with cruel eyes and tobacco-stained teeth, rode onto her property. They didn't bother with the gate, simply cutting the wire fence Samuel had so painstakingly stretched. "Ma'am," one of them drawled, staying on his horse, while the other dismounted and made a show of walking to her well pump. "Mr. Corrigan sent us. He's heard talk of Comanches in the area. Just wanted to make sure you were safe." The man at the well pumped water into his hat and let his horse drink a deliberate act of ownership. "Mighty fine water," he said. "Be a shame if the source got tainted." Lucinda stood on her porch, the Winchester held loosely at her side, its barrel pointed at the ground, but ready. "I'm safe enough. And my water is for my stock. Tell your boss to keep his mongrels on his own land." The first man chuckled a humorless sound. "That's the thing, ma'am. Mr. Corrigan is starting to think all this land is his land. He's just waiting for the paperwork to catch up." He tipped his hat. "You have a good day now." They rode off, leaving the cut fence gaping like a wound. Lucinda knew it was a message. This was just the beginning. Corrigan was testing her, pushing her, seeing how much pressure she could take before she broke. The whispers in Redemption Gulch had started too. On her next trip for supplies, she could feel the change. People who used to give her a polite nod now averted their eyes. Mildred Peterson was frostier than ever, practically throwing her purchases onto the counter. "Heard you had some trouble out your way," Mildred said, her voice laced with insinuation. "Just a cut fence," Lucinda replied evenly. "That's not what I hear," Mildred pressed, lowering her voice. "Frank, the blacksmith's boy, said he saw tracks near your property. Shod horses and others, unshod. Said they looked like Indian ponies." The town's fear of the Comanche was a palpable thing, a deep-seated terror born of years of bloody conflict. To be associated with them, even tangentially, was to be branded a sympathizer, a traitor. "Frank's a boy with an imagination," Lucinda said, her jaw tight. "And I'm a widow, trying to run a ranch. I don't have time for gossip." But the seed of suspicion had been planted. She was the woman who lived alone, the woman who refused to sell to the most powerful man around, and now the woman who had unexplained tracks on her land. The walls were closing in, both from Corrigan's greed and the town's fear. That night, a storm rolled in a magnificent, violent spectacle of the plains. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in stark monochrome flashes. Thunder rattled the very foundations of her small house. Lucinda sat by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass, feeling as trapped and turbulent as the weather outside. In a brilliant flash of lightning, she saw him. He was sitting on a horse at the crest of the ridge, overlooking her homestead, a silhouette against the stormy sky. He was motionless, a statue of a man watching her house. He was too far away to make out any features, but she knew. It wasn't one of Corrigan's men. He was an Indian, a warrior. Fear, primal and immediate, shot through her. She ducked away from the window, her hand instinctively going for the rifle propped against the wall. Had they come back? Was it not the baby's family who had taken him? Was this a war party? She crept to the window and peered through a crack in the shutters. He was still there, a silent, unmoving sentinel in the heart of the storm. He wasn't attacking. He was just watching, waiting. For the rest of the night, every crash of thunder sounded like a hoofbeat, every gust of wind like a war cry. She didn't sleep. She sat in her chair, the Winchester across her lap, her eyes fixed on the ridge. When the first grey light of dawn broke through the clouds, he was gone. He had been a shadow in the storm, a whisper on the wind. But Lucinda knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would be back, and when he returned he would not be coming for the child. He would be coming for her. The watching continued for 3 days. He was never close, never threatening, but always present. At dawn she would see his silhouette on the eastern ridge. At midday, a flicker of movement in the cottonwoods by the creek. At dusk, a lone figure on the western mesa outlined against the bleeding sunset. He was a ghost on the edges of her world, a constant, unnerving presence. Lucinda existed in a state of high alert, every nerve frayed. She did her chores with the Winchester slung over her shoulder, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She slept in her clothes, the rifle by her bed. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach. Yet beneath the fear, something else was stirring a profound and unsettling curiosity. He hadn't tried to harm her. He hadn't stolen her livestock or tried to burn her down. He just watched. On the fourth day he made his move. It was late afternoon. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. Lucinda was in the corral, brushing down her mare Bess, when the horse suddenly went rigid. Her ears swiveled, her nostrils flared, and she let out a low, nervous whinny. Lucinda went still, her hand resting on Bess's neck. She listened. There was no sound but the ever-present wind. She slowly reached for the rifle propped against the corral fence. There is no need for that. The voice was deep and calm, spoken with a heavy accent, but clear diction. It came from behind her. She spun around, bringing the rifle up to her shoulder in a single fluid motion. He stood just outside the corral, not 20 feet away. He had approached on foot, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the very rock of the mesas. His black hair was long braided, with strips of otter fur. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes so dark they seemed to hold the emptiness of the night sky. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple leather vest over his bare chest, which was crisscrossed with the faint, silvery lines of old scars. He held no weapon, his hands open at his sides, in a gesture of peace. But there was a power radiating from him, a stillness that was more intimidating than any overt threat. It was the man from the ridge. "Who are you?" Lucinda demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The Winchester's sights were trained on the center of his chest. "My name is Comanche," he said. His eyes flickered down to the rifle, and then back to her face. "I have not come to harm you." "You've been spying on me for days." She counted her knuckles white on the gun stock. "Forgive me if I don't take you at your word." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I have been watching. I had to be certain." "Certain of what?" Instead of answering, he looked past her, his gaze fixing on the small sod house. "You have a brave heart, Lucinda Dalton." Hearing him say her name was a shock. It felt intimate, proprietary. "How do you know my name?" "The wind carries whispers. The men in your town, they speak of the stubborn widow at Whispering Creek." He took a slow step forward. "Do not shoot. I have come to give you thanks." "Thanks for what?" she asked, though a dawning realization was beginning to bloom in her mind. He raised a hand and pointed a long, calloused finger toward the house. "My son. You saved my son." The words hung in the air between them. The pieces clicked into place, the baby, the feather, the silent watching. This was the father. The silent rider in the storm was a grieving parent who had been observing the woman who held his child's life in her hands. Slowly, cautiously, she lowered the rifle, though she kept it held tight across her body. "He's alive. He's well." A flicker of profound emotion crossed Comanche's stoic face, a brief crack in the granite facade. "He is. He is with his grandmother now. The bite you tended, your medicine was strong. The shaman said you saved him from the spirit of the rot." He paused. "His name is not Little Cat. It is Tohopko. It means wild cat. It seems you knew him well." The relief was so overwhelming, it made her dizzy. "I found him in the gully. The Coyotes." "I know." Comanche interrupted, his voice low and tight with remembered pain. "I have seen the dead one." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw past the warrior. She saw the anguish of a father who had almost lost everything. "We were attacked. A rival band, the Kiowa. In the chaos of the fight, my wife was killed. Tohopko was strapped to her cradle board. The horse bolted. We searched for 2 days. We found the horse, the empty cradle board. We found tracks of coyotes. We believed he was gone. We mourned him. Lucinda could barely imagine the horror. How did you find him here? My brother scouting found the tracks of a woman's boot leading from the gully. He found the blood of the coyote you killed. He followed them here. He is the one who took the boy from your cellar. He moves like a shadow. He left the feather so you would know it was our people, not your enemies. It all made sense. The silent retrieval, the watching. They hadn't been judging her. They had been honoring her, trying to understand the strange white woman who would fight a pack of coyotes for a Comanche child. I did what anyone would have done, she said quietly. Comanche shook his head. No, not anyone. My people are hunted in this land. Your people see us as less than human. A white woman who saves a Comanche baby is rarer than a river in the desert. You showed him a mother's heart when his own mothers had been silenced. You gave me back my son. For this my life is in your debt. The weight of his words, the sheer intensity in his dark eyes was staggering. In the Comanche world, a debt of life was the most sacred bond that could exist. There is no debt, she said, uncomfortable with the gravity of the moment. I'm just glad he is safe. He stood there for a long moment, the setting sun casting his long shadow over her. He was studying her, his gaze taking in her worn dress, the calluses on her hands, the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw not just a woman, but a survivor, a fighter. He saw a strength that mirrored his own. The debt remains, he said finally, and it must be paid. The men who want your land, the ones you call Corrigan and Brody, their greed, is a sickness that spreads. They push into our hunting grounds from the west, and they squeeze you from the east. They are my enemy, as much as they are yours. He took another step closer, his presence commanding his voice, dropping to a serious, almost ceremonial tone. You are a warrior woman, alone on this island of water. I am a war chief, with no wife to anchor my home. You saved the future of my bloodline. I will save the future of yours. He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze unwavering. Lucinda Dalton, to honor this debt, and to forge an alliance that will protect us both, I have come to offer you marriage. The proposal struck Lucinda with the force of a physical blow. The wind seemed to die, the chirping of the crickets ceased, and the entire world narrowed to the space between her and the Comanche war chief. Marriage. The word was so absurd, so utterly alien in this context, that she almost laughed. But there was no humor in Comanche's dark, serious eyes. He was not making a romantic overture. He was forging a treaty. Marriage. She finally managed to choke out the word tasting strange on her tongue. You can't be serious. I am a chief of the Antelope Band. I do not speak words I do not mean. He replied, his tone even betraying no offense at her shock. This is not a proposal of the heart as your people know it. It is a pact, a binding of two peoples against a common enemy. Lucinda shook her head, trying to clear the fog of disbelief. I can't. My husband Samuel is buried on that hill. I am a white woman. You are, she trailed off, not wanting to say the words, but the chasm between their worlds was vast and undeniable. I am Comanche, he finished for her, his voice hard as flint. And you are a white woman. I see this. But I also see a woman who draws a line in the dust and dares the world to cross it. I see a woman who needs allies. Do your people help you? Does your sheriff protect you? No. They conspire to steal from you. They whisper about you. You are as alone in your world as I am in mine. Every word was true, and the truth of it stung. She was utterly alone. Corrigan was circling like a vulture, the town was turning on her, and her only companion had been a child who wasn't hers. What would this marriage even mean? She asked the question, feeling both practical and insane. It means this, Comanche said, gesturing to the land around them. This homestead becomes my home. My warriors become your guardians. When Corrigan's men ride to your fence, they will not find a lone woman. They will find 20 Comanche warriors standing with her. When the sheriff comes with his false laws, he will have to speak to me. Your creek will be protected. Your life will be protected. And in return, she pressed her mind, struggling to process the strategic implications. You will be my wife. You will be a mother to Tohopko. My people will see the woman who saved him is now one of us, bound by honor. It will create a bridge. It will give my son a mother's care, and it will give my people a powerful ally who understands this land and the ways of the white man. He paused, his gaze intense. I do not ask for your bed. I do not ask for your heart. That is a thing that must be earned if it is ever to be given. I ask for your name. I ask for your alliance. It was a business transaction cloaked in the language of ceremony, a merger of two desperate, besieged forces, her grit and her land with his strength and his warriors. The logic of it was terrifyingly sound. It was a lifeline, a shield against the storm that was coming. But the cost was immense. She would be crossing a line from which there was no return. She would become an outcast in truth, not just in practice, the wife of a Comanche chief. The very idea was scandalous, dangerous. I need time to think, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Comanche nodded, a gesture of respect. The sun will set and rise again. I will be back for your answer when it stands at its highest point tomorrow. He looked at her one last time. Think of the child, Lucinda Dalton. Think of the future you saved. And think of the wolves, the two-legged ones who wish to tear it all down. Without another word, he turned and melted back into the landscape as silently as he had appeared, leaving Lucinda alone with the echo of his impossible offer. That night was the longest of her life. She didn't light the lamp, preferring to sit in the dark, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She paced the small cabin, her footsteps tracing the worn path in the floorboards. She went to the small chest where she kept Samuel's things, his worn Bible, a tintype photograph of them on their wedding day, a lock of his sandy hair. What do I do, Samuel? She whispered into the darkness, tears welling in her eyes. They'll take it all. Everything we built. They'll ruin it. Samuel had been a good man, a gentleman. He believed in the law, in doing things the right way. But the law in Redemption Gulch belonged to Bart Corrigan. There was no justice to be had there. Samuel's way would lead to her losing everything. She thought of little Cat of Tohopko, the fierce grip of his tiny hand, the way his dark eyes had followed her. She had saved his life. Now his father was offering to save hers. It was a perfect, terrible symmetry. Was this betrayal? Betraying Samuel's memory? Betraying her own people, who would surely call her a traitor? An Indian lover? A squaw? Or was it survival? Was it the only sane choice in an insane world? The first light of dawn found her sitting on the porch, the Winchester across her lap, her face pale and drawn. She had watched the sun rise, just as she had for the past 2 years as a widow. But today felt different. Today was not an ending, but a precipice. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, she saw them. Not just Comanche. He rode at the head of a column of 20 warriors. They appeared over the ridge not with whoops or cries, but in a powerful, disciplined silence. They were armed for war. Their faces painted their lances and rifles held at the ready. It was a staggering display of strength, a clear message to any who might be watching. They rode down into the small valley and stopped a respectful distance from her house, their ponies shifting and snorting in the midday heat. Comanche dismounted and walked toward her alone. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his face unreadable, and waited. He did not ask the question again. His presence was the question. Lucinda's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. The moment of choosing. She could say no, and he and his warriors would ride away, leaving her to face Corrigan alone. Or she could say yes, and step into a new life so radically different from her old one that it felt like stepping off the edge of the world. She looked at his strong, stoic face. She looked at the warriors behind him, a silent promise of protection. She looked at the land, her land, which was threatened with extinction. She thought of a tiny, feverish baby and the fierce, protective love she had felt for him. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up. She leaned the Winchester against the wall of the house, a symbolic gesture of setting aside her old way of fighting her battles alone. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked down at him. "Yes," she said, her voice, clear and strong, carrying in the still air. "The answer is yes." A flicker of something relief, respect, perhaps even victory passed through Comanche's eyes. He gave a single sharp nod. The pact was sealed. The widow of Whispering Creek now had an army. The change was immediate and absolute. Comanche's warriors did not move into her house, but they inhabited the land around it. They set up a small, discreet camp in the cottonwood grove by the creek, their lodges blending so perfectly with the landscape that a casual observer would miss them entirely. Sentries, silent and unseen, took up positions on the high ridges, their sharp eyes watching every approach. The Dalton homestead was no longer an isolated ranch. It was a fortress. Life for Lucinda transformed into a surreal blend of two cultures. Comanche was a man of his word. He treated her not with affection, but with a deep, formal respect. He took his meals with her at the small wooden table Samuel had built, a silent, powerful presence in her home. They spoke little, their communication, a patchwork of his deliberate English, her hesitant gestures, and a surprising amount of mutual understanding. He taught her things. He showed her which plants in the creek bed could be ground into a paste to soothe a burn, and which roots, when boiled, would settle a restless stomach. He pointed out the subtle signs of animal tracks she had never noticed, and taught her to read the sky for warnings of a coming storm. In return, she shared her coffee, strong and black, and taught him the names of her tools and the workings of the water pump. It was a slow, cautious dance of discovery. Twice one of his warriors brought Tohopko to the homestead. The baby was healthy and thriving, cradled in the arms of a stern, elderly woman with kind eyes, his grandmother. On these visits, Lucinda was allowed to hold him, to feel his small weight in her arms again. Seeing the child, she knew she had made the right choice. Comanche would watch her with his son, his stoic expression unreadable, but she sensed a quiet approval. He was seeing her not as a white woman, but as a mother. The news of this unholy alliance spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. It was carried by one of Corrigan's ranch hands, who had ridden out to deliver another warning, only to be met at the property line by two silent, armed Comanche warriors. The ranch hand had fled back to town with a wild-eyed story of the Dalton widow shacking up with a whole band of savages. The reaction was predictable and venomous. She was now officially a pariah. Mildred Peterson refused to sell her supplies, turning her back when Lucinda entered the store. The blacksmith, a man who had once been friendly with Samuel, spat on the ground as she passed. They called her Comanche Joe, a name dripping with scorn and disgust. Only Dr. Garrett, a weary intellectual from back east, who was perpetually disappointed by the lack of civilization in the West, offered a sliver of humanity. "You're playing with fire, Lucinda." He warned her quietly on the street, avoiding the glares of the other townsfolk. "Corrigan owns this town, and he's whipping people into a frenzy. He's telling them this isn't just about your land anymore. He's saying you've brought a hostile war party to their doorstep." "They're not hostile," Lucinda countered. "They're protecting their own." "That's not how Corrigan is spinning it," Dr. Garrett said, shaking his head sadly. "Be careful." Bartholomew Corrigan was indeed spinning it. He saw this not as a setback, but as a golden opportunity. He could no longer paint this as a simple land dispute against a helpless widow. Now it was a righteous crusade. He was the brave citizen protecting the good people of Redemption Gulch from an Indian menace harbored by a traitorous woman. It was the perfect pretext to raise a posse and wipe out both Lucinda and her newfound allies, seizing the land under the guise of public safety. He went straight to Sheriff Brody. "You're going to deputize 20 of my men," Corrigan ordered, his voice low and menacing in the confines of the sheriff's office. "We're going out there to eradicate a threat to this community." Brody, ever the sycophant, but also a coward, hesitated. "Bart riding onto her land with a posse? That's a provocation. The Rangers might get involved." Corrigan slammed his fist on the desk. "The Rangers are 100 miles and 3 days away. By the time they get here, the threat will be neutralized, and we'll be town heroes. That woman has brought a nest of vipers to our doorstep. Are you the law, or are you going to let a bunch of heathens and a turncoat widow dictate terms?" The pressure was too much. Brody buckled as Corrigan knew he would. The sheriff began signing deputization papers for Corrigan's most ruthless ranch hands, and a handful of frightened, easily led townsmen. A war was coming to Whispering Creek. The news reached Lucinda through one of Comanche's scouts, a young brave named Chackley, who moved through the plains like the wind. He reported a large group of men gathering at the Corrigan ranch, cleaning rifles and saddling horses. Comanche received the news with grim stoicism. He gathered his warriors in the cottonwood grove, their mood shifting from watchful peace to a quiet, lethal readiness. Lucinda found him there, watching his men prepare. "They're coming," she said, her voice tight. "Yes," he replied, his eyes on the horizon. "They believe because they are many. They are strong. They do not understand this land. It does not fight for them." A cold fear sharper than any she had felt before gripped her. This was no longer about intimidation or threats. Men would die. Blood would be spilled on her land. "There has to be another way." "There is not," Comanche said, turning to face her. "Corrigan's greed is a hungry wolf. It will not stop until it is fed or it is killed." He looked at her, his gaze searching. "Are you afraid?" "I'm terrified," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Good," he said, a surprising softness in his tone. "Fear keeps you sharp. Your husband, Samuel, he was not a fighter." It was a statement, not a question. The mention of Samuel startled her. No, he was a builder, a farmer. He believed in the law. "And the law failed him," Comanche said. His eyes locked with hers, and in that moment he decided to tell her a truth he had learned from his scouts, a story pieced together from drunken boasts in the Redemption Gulch saloon. "Sheriff Brody was there the day the fever was said to have taken your husband. But Samuel Dalton didn't have the fever. He had a disagreement with Corrigan over water rights. Brody and 2 of Corrigan's men held him down, while Corrigan encouraged him to see reason. The fever was an invention to hide the bruises." The world tilted, the ground falling away beneath Lucinda's feet. Samuel, her gentle Samuel, he hadn't just died. He had been murdered. The sickness, the peaceful passing she had grieved. It was all a lie. They had killed him to get to her land. The fear in her heart was instantly consumed by a white-hot, cleansing rage. The last vestiges of her old self, the grieving widow, the law-abiding citizen, were burned away. In their place stood something harder, something colder, something forged in the unforgiving fire of the West. She looked at Comanche, her blue eyes now chips of ice. "When they come," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor, "they're not just trespassing on my land. They are standing on my husband's grave. Make sure they know it." Comanche nodded slowly, a deep respect dawning in his eyes. He was no longer looking at just an ally. He was looking at a warrior. Corrigan's posse of 30 men rode onto the Dalton homestead at dawn, finding an unnerving silence where they expected a fight. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. They found Lucinda waiting on the porch, not in a widow's dress, but in work trousers, the Winchester resting across her lap. She was not a victim. She was the bait. Corrigan reined in his horse, 50 yards from the house, the posse fanning out behind him. He smirked at the sight of her. "Well, look at this. Comanche Joe herself. I gave you a chance to walk away, woman. Now I'm here to reclaim this land for decent folk." "This land is mine, Bart," Lucinda called out, her voice ringing with steel. "Bought and paid for with the sweat and blood of my husband." "Your husband is dead," Corrigan spat, "and you've dishonored him by laying with savages." Before he could say more, an arrow hissed out of the seemingly empty landscape, embedding itself in the dirt inches from his horse's hooves. The animal screamed and reared, throwing the posse into confusion. As men fumbled for their guns, Comanche and 10 of his warriors rose from the creek bed, like ghosts forming a silent, unwavering line between the posse and the house. Their faces were painted, their weapons ready. Corrigan regained his composure, his face purple with rage. "See the whole pack of 'em open fire." But Lucinda's voice cut through the tension like a knife aimed not at Corrigan, but at his sheriff. "Sheriff Brody," she yelled, her voice carrying an authority no one had ever heard from her. "You're a long way from your jurisdiction, but you're not far from your crimes." Brody flinched. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I'm talking about Samuel Dalton," she boomed, standing to her full height. "I'm talking about the fever that took him, the fever that left bruises on his neck and chest, the fever that came in the form of you and Corrigan." A murmur of shock rippled through the townsmen in the posse. They had come to fight Indians, not to be accomplices to a murder. "That's a lie," Corrigan roared, but his denial was drowned out as Lucinda's gaze locked onto a young, terrified deputy named Peter. "Peter, you were there that day, weren't you? You stayed outside. You heard it. Tell them what you heard." The young deputy, trapped between Corrigan's murderous glare and Lucinda's righteous fury, finally broke. "She's right," he stammered, his voice cracking. I heard shouting. The sheriff told me to forget it." The admission shattered the posse's unity. The townsmen, realizing they'd been used, began to back their horses away. Corrigan, seeing his power evaporate, let out a bellow of rage and raised his rifle, aiming directly at Lucinda. He never fired. Comanche had been waiting for the move. An arrow flew from his bow with blinding speed, striking Corrigan in the shoulder of his gun arm. He screamed, dropping the rifle. At the same instant, a chilling war cry erupted as the rest of Comanche's warriors descended from the rocks, hitting the posse's flanks. The fight was a swift and brutal rout. Corrigan's hired guns, outmaneuvered and terrified, broke and fled. Within minutes, it was over. The only ones left were a wounded, defeated Corrigan and a blubbering Sheriff Brody, pulled from their horses and held fast by the warriors. Comanche walked to the porch where Lucinda stood, his expression unreadable. His eyes asked the silent question. This was her land. This was her justice. He was ceding the final judgment to her. She walked down the steps and stood before the two men who had destroyed her life. The urge for vengeance was a hot, tempting fire. She could order them killed, and no one would stop her. But she looked up at the hill where Samuel was buried, remembering the good man. He was a man who believed in law, however broken. Killing them would make her no better than they were. "Tie them to their horses," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Send them back to Redemption Gulch. Let Peter tell his story. Let the town see them for what they are. You'll rot in a prison. That's a fate worse than a quick death for men like you." Comanche nodded, once a sign of deep respect for her wisdom. As his warriors carried out her orders, he stood beside her on the porch. The dust was settling, and the silence returning to the valley was one of peace, not tension. "The debt is paid," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." The marriage had been a pact of survival, but in the crucible of that day, something else had been forged, a partnership built on a respect that ran deeper than any treaty. "What now?" she asked the future, an unknown territory. Comanche looked at her then toward the cottonwood grove where his son would be waiting. He looked at her small, defiant house and the land that was now truly theirs and safe. A faint, unaccustomed smile touched his lips. "Now," he said. "We begin." Video pans up from Lucinda and Comanche, showing the peaceful homestead. The Comanche warriors are quietly receding back into the landscape, their vigil unbroken. The image fades to black. Conclusion. Lucinda Dalton's story wasn't just about survival. It was about rebirth. She found that strength isn't just about enduring hardship alone, but about having the courage to forge alliances in the most unexpected places. The pact she made with Comanche, born of desperation, became a bridge between two worlds, proving that honor, courage, and a parent's love speak a language that transcends culture and prejudice. Theirs was a new kind of family, a new kind of power, built on the foundations of mutual respect in the heart of the unforgiving West. They didn't just save a piece of land, they planted the seeds for a future no one could have ever predicted. If this story of courage and unlikely alliances moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a powerful tale, and subscribing to our channel for more true stories from the forgotten corners of history. Your support allows us to keep these incredible legacies alive. Thank you for listening.